Welcome to the top-rated and award-nominated Grad School Femtoring podcast, the place for First-Gen BIPOCs to learn about all things grad school, personal development, and sustainable productivity. This is Doctora Yvette Martinez-Vu, and I will be serving as your Femtor, providing you with tips and tricks and everything else you need to know to successfully navigate grad school and beyond. For over 13 years, I've been empowering first-gen students of color along their academic and professional journeys, and I'm really excited to support you too. Doctora Yvette here. Before starting today's episode, I want to announce that my co-authored book, Is Grad School for Me, Demystifying the Application Process for First-Gen BIPOC Students, is available for pre-order. It officially comes out on April 16th, and between now and the rest of the year, my co-author and I are available to speak at your next event. We are excited because this is the first book that provides first-generation, low-income, and non-traditional students of color with insider knowledge on how to consider and navigate grad school. It's the book that we both wish we had when we were undertaking our own grad admissions process at UCLA many years ago. The book is both a corrective and a calling card to the lack of clear guidance for historically excluded students navigating the onerous and often overwhelming process of applying to grad school. We walk you through the process from first asking yourself whether grad school is even the right next step for you, to then providing you with step-by-step instructions on how to maneuver every aspect of the grad admissions process, including providing you with sample essays, templates, and relatable scenarios. If you're interested, we encourage you to pre-order your copy today or have your local library order a copy. You can also reach out to us for bulk order discount codes. Lastly, we are available for book talks, workshops, keynotes, panels, and even book club visitations. Go to www.gradschoolfemtoring.com/book to learn more. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Grad School Femtoring podcast. This is your host, Doctora Yvette. Today, we're going to be discussing the topic of writing and publishing academic articles. Our guest is actually one of my dear friends and Femtor, Doctora Miroslava Chavez-Garcia. She's a professor of history and faculty director of the McNair Scholars Program at UC Santa Barbara. That's how we met. She's published 3 books, including her most recent work, Migrant Longing, Letter Writing Across the U.S Mexico Borderlands, a slice in the life of her family history. She is currently working on a new project, The Architects of Hate, Eugenics, Population Control, and Environmentalism in the Fight for Immigration Restriction in the Late 20th Century. She's also a big fan of the medium we're going to be discussing today, which is article writing. She's published numerous academic articles in peer-reviewed journals, anthologies, handbooks, and textbooks, as well as professional blogs and websites. And to be frank, if it wasn't for her, I don't know that we would be having this book out this year. So, one of the things that I wanted to mention is that Doctora Miroslava is also the co-author of the book that we have coming out in April, titled Is Grad School for Me, Demystifying the Application Process for First-Gen BIPOC Students. Doctora Miroslava also wants us to know, or wants you, the listeners, to know that she is first generation, Chicana, Mexicana, immigrant with working class roots. And yeah, I'm super excited to have her on the podcast today. So welcome to the podcast, Miros.
Yes, thank you so much, Yvette. We've been talking so much about this, so it's fantastic to have it come to fruition. Yeah,
It's such a long time coming. I'm so glad that finally I get you on the podcast and for the listeners to hear more about you and from you. So if you can tell us a little bit more, just so that folks can get to know more about your background and your work. So who you are, what you do, anything you're comfortable sharing about your background too.
sure. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. It's always great to have a chance to share, especially with your audience. I listen to your podcast, and I think it's so, as I told you in the past, I find it so invigorating to listen to, especially in the mornings. It gets my day off, and I get like a little extra step in my, a little, what is it, a little extra bump in my step or whatever, lift. And we always need that. So it's really inspiring. But yeah, so I did, as you mentioned, all these things define who I am as a first-gen Chicana Mexicana immigrant. Roots, was raised in California since I was a baby. So really, I'm like the one and a half immigrant, whatever, how it's talked about. And we also grew up very poor for the most part. I mean, you don't know you're poor until you go to college, right? So this idea of being impoverished. But I was born in the border of Mexicali, Baja California, but I was raised in Imperial Valley for a few years. And then we moved to San Jose. And then where I graduated through high school. And then I spent my formative years really in Los Angeles at UCLA, undergrad and grad school. I think we have that in common. We have a lot in common. And so after grad school, I spent a year, I had a postdoc. And then my first job was in Arizona. I went to Arizona, Northern Arizona University. So that was a little bit of a shock, even though it's not that far. It's still not California centered. So that was wonderful people there. But then I was very fortunate to land a job at UC Davis in Chicana and Chicano studies there. So I was at UC Davis for 13 years. And then I was very fortunate to get this job at UC Santa Barbara. And so I just love it here. We're going to stay here. So I see a lot of, on the one hand, a lot of fortune, on the other hand, a lot of support from people. And also just trying to make opportunities happen when they can and do happen. But I would say, like, I just want to dig a little bit more deeply, I think, in thinking about, like, a little bit, I don't want to say about my drive, but like what has shaped who I am. And I think we have this in common too. Definitely, one of my most formative moments in my life has been the death of my parents. We both had experience for, both my parents died at the age of 12 and your father died at the age of 12. So, my parents were killed in a car accident. We were returning from a trip from Mexico. Myself and my brother and my grandmother were in the car, and my grandmother also died. So my brother and I were the only survivors. I was 12, he was 13, and needless to say, our lives were sort of, turned upside down. And definitely that experience and everything that happened as a consequence sort of shaped who I am today, and it continues to shape who I am today. And so I think for both my brother and I, it just meant, one, you have to grow up really fast, right? You grow up overnight, you don't get to have a childhood. It's a different kind of a childhood. But then it also, for me, was sort of this, after I had my aunt and uncle who raised me, but I felt like they were never imposing on me, like, do this or do that. So I kind of had that quote unquote freedom to do kind of whatever I wanted to with their support. But still, it didn't make it, overall, it's not something that I would have ever desired. And it's something that you continue to live with, this whole thing of like, you'll get over it or learn. No, it becomes a part of who you are and it shapes you. And I think that that's something, a lot of that trauma is still with me, certainly. I have no doubt. So yeah, and my brother too, he's actually very successful, I would say. He's a medical doctor and is doing really well with his practice. He has a beautiful family. So yeah, we're very fortunate that we're able to succeed. I guess we can call that success.
I've heard you share this part of your backstory multiple times, and every single time you talk about it, I get emotional. Every single time. Because I picture, like, your inner niña, or I picture you as a child at that age, to have your life just completely turned upside down in one moment is a lot, and it's definitely a formative moment. And I think that we immediately bonded from having that shared experience. Although I do have the fortune or the privilege that I have my mom around, it's still, to lose a parent is something that I just, it's so hard at any age, no matter what stage of life you're at, no matter how old your parents are. It's really, really a difficult thing to navigate through. So yeah, it's no wonder then to see how successful you are, especially like from the outsider perspective. You have accomplished so much, and one of the things that I've looked up to you for, well, one is you being a kind mentor, femtor, and an advocate on behalf of a lot of people. That's one thing that I knew off the top of my head. It was like this, I want to be in this person's life. Like, I want this person to be my femtor because I've heard really good things about her. But then also I knew about like you being successful at publishing, and I keep saying it. Like I really don't think we would have this book out if it hadn't been for you, because I've had that idea for a long time, but I needed that support, I needed that
Mhm.
mentorship, I needed that guidance, and that's why I wanted to bring you on here, and I thought it would be great for you to talk a little bit more about that publishing process, because I do think a lot of people are interested in publishing and writing and publishing, getting their work out there. They just don't know how, or they're expected to know how by their advisors, by their programs, and it's not always a straightforward process. So I guess we can dive into today's topic by
Sure.
maybe telling us a little bit more about what drew you to academic scholarship and publishing.
Sure. I think I would just go back to our last topic on the topic of loss. I mean, we could talk about that for a long time, but
Mhm.
there's like a bond when people share some of their experiences, you bond with them. But yeah, in terms of, while we're here, academic articles, a book. Um, so for me, I got really interested in Chicano history as an undergraduate when a professor handed me a book called Between Borders, Essays on Chicana History. Was published in 1988. I went to look at the date. I was like, oh my goodness. So, but editor was Adelaida del Castillo and had a bunch of articles about Mexicana history. And it just, especially one I gravitated towards, was focusing on Spanish Mexican women in the 19th century. And it was about all the negative stereotypes about them that contemporary writers, Anglo Americans, had written about women and their perceptions of California, particularly in that period, and really, racist, derogatory, and all these things. And so she kind of, what we call today, deconstructed that. Back in when she wrote it, it wasn't perhaps the way we talked about it, but she did this sort of decolonizing, the literature. So she did a lot of that. That was really inspiring to me, and I wanted to do that kind of history, right? To figure out who these women were, how they overcame these challenges in the 19th century. And also, I used my grandmother as inspiration. So my abuelita, when I would go visit her in
Mm.
Mexico, like I would notice how difficult she had it. And so I thought, like, my goodness, how do these women do it, on so little and being able to make it, every day? So I just wanted to really, recover and tell that history. And in terms of articles, I like articles I learned in grad school. So books are really important as well. We can talk about books in another segment. But
Mhm.
articles are really effective because I think that they help you distill your argument in sort of a very short period of whatever writing. We might think of it as very long, but it's short in terms of if you compare it to books. So
Mhm.
articles tend to be so. Yeah, the articles tend to be about 30 published pages. And let me just preface this by saying I'm in the field of humanities. I'm a historian. I do think this is kind of some of these things also are germane to fields of social sciences and the
Yeah.
humanities. But I'll just say it generally, and I'll give you like exceptions to these things I'll be saying today. So generally 30 pages, which is like 7,000 to 10,000 words. A book ranges like to 90,000 to 110, 120,000.
Yeah.
So that's kind of so the articles force you to be concise and to get to the point of what you want to say quickly. So essays are also often the testing ground for a larger project for like a book. So usually when
Mhm.
in grad school, we used to always say like read the article first because that give you like the really distilled idea. And then the
Mhm.
book usually would from that branch out into different directions. So that's what I found about articles. And also, I really love articles because they're definitely more attractive to readers because they're more consumable. A structure you can sit down and read it pretty much in one sitting, and you can't do that with a book. Well, at least I can't. I'm a very slow reader with books, so you get a real satisfaction from them. But I think that articles really allow you to get a lot of information and insights in a really short period of time. That's why I think articles are a good way to go. When you can do them.
And so for someone who's interested in publishing an article, what does that process look like? Can you break it down for us, like from beginning to end? I know it might differ, but just generally speaking, like from the ideation process
Yes.
to the final manuscript stage, what happens in that
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
between?
I mean, I could write a whole book about that. I was taking
That
notes.
yeah,
Yeah, I thought like,
I
how
think you
much
will.
detail? Maybe we'll see. But I did first want to direct your listeners to your episode 180, where it's the 6 ways to overcome dissertation writing anxiety, because a lot of what I would have talked about is like, yeah, how even to get, I won't say the pencil to the paper because we don't use that, but how to even get your fingertips on the keyboard. Sometimes just the
Mhm.
anxiety of getting there. I could talk about that as well in a whole other
Yeah.
book about that's a challenge. But let's just move on. Say we're like ready
Yeah.
to go. But I think okay, so academic writing really depends on what stage you are in your career path and your trajectory. So what
Mhm.
that's going to look like will look differently. So, I mean, the question is, are you a first year grad student? Are you a fourth year student? Are you finishing up your thesis or your dissertation? Are you a new PhD looking to land a job? And so it's
Mm.
really important to think about the different steps, depending on where you're in your career, right? The
Yeah.
context, right? So let's take a scenario. I was just trying to be mindful of your audience, of a graduate student, since many of your listeners are grad students
Mhm.
and thinking about that role for themselves. So usually, as you might have already discussed at some point, in the first 2 years, the first 2 to 3 years are not. You're mostly working on your program. You're not actively working on academic articles. Um, because you're going through coursework, your exams, and acclimating to the grad school culture, which can be, if you can get through those first 3 years
Yeah.
sane, then we're doing great. But then after that, there's no way at that point, there's no real pressure, right? Isn't on to publish the way it is later.
Yeah.
By your fourth year, when you pass your exams, if you're doing a PhD program, you're more focused exclusively on the dissertation, you'll begin to feel the pressure of publishing. Your advisor may not tell you, although often they do, especially in the social sciences. Some fields are very intensive, but your colleagues will begin to talk about it, right? You'll hear the
Yeah.
whispers or you hear the comments at the coffee shops, wherever people talk about who got jobs and why they did and didn't get jobs. And publishing will be at the very top of that list. Did people say, did they have an article? How many? Where did they publish? So
Mhm.
depending on your field, you need to be really conscious about your field. It's going to be different responses. So I would say that definitely because of the competitive nature in academia, um, it requires a publication, one or at least two, if you could. In the past, I
Mhm.
used to say that's not, but I think it is much more important because I've seen what students have. And what those publications look like, they can and should vary in my mind. And I think variety shows depth and breadth. So I think that's
Mhm.
important to remember, to have a diverse portfolio, right? Just like any field,
Mhm.
you're going to want to have that. Okay, so let me get into more nitty-gritty. Maybe that was
Yeah.
seem nitty-gritty, but I'll get into a little more nitty-gritty. So I think the first thing you need to do is look at sample essays, right? Sample journal articles in your field. Look at your favorite journals, look to see the structure, the tone or the writing style, the content, and also, of course, how they cite their sources, citation methods. That's really important. You're going to be expected to follow the same criteria, not word for word, because nobody wants the same thing. But you need to include those elements somewhere and somehow in your article, right? Um, so this also speaks to audience. I think it's important when you're looking at a journal to pay attention to the audience in your mind as you structure and you write your
Mhm.
essay. In grad school, I was never told about audience. I never thought about because that's the
Yeah.
first thing that a publisher will ask you, like, who's your audience? And
Yes.
you're like, everyone. Isn't everyone going to read this? No, not everyone's going to read this. So for instance, if you're going to publish, an audience for Harvard's economic review will be different than radical review or whatever. So it's obviously going to be different
Mhm.
people. Um, and I should also say that articles are different than book chapters. Sometimes people think they're like the same thing or they're not sure. They're very different. Not very different, but they do contain different kind of information and even can look different. But we can talk about that more later. So we're focusing right now on articles.
Mhm.
Okay. So the other thing as well with journals, when you look at them, sometimes they have special issues on a particular theme.
Yeah.
So I didn't edited a special issue on gender and intimacy, and so all the articles in there focus on that. It's not like it's better than or the other, or worse than. One is better than the other. It just means that if you're in a special issue, somebody's looking for issues of gender intimacy, they're going to go there maybe to look for other articles and then see yours too. So it
Mhm.
could be beneficial. Sometimes they take longer though to come out, like a lot longer, just for different reasons because there's more people involved and so forth. So that could be an issue there. Okay, I'm going to continue to a couple more nitty gritty things. So, what does an essay actually look like? What is contained in it? Right? Usually, we just say go out there and write it.
Mhm.
You're like, oh, what? So, there's four main sections to the essays that I would say. First of all, you need to talk about the project overview. Very simply, what's it about? What are the major themes? What are the issues? And what are the sub themes or sub topics you will explore? Right. So that's your overview. This is what it's about. The second part you want to talk about. the contribution to the literature or your intervention. That means, what are you saying that is new and different, right? What are you bringing that we don't already know? It can be tricky, right? There's no one way to approach this because sometimes it could be a new insight that you bring, or it could be a new set of data or sources that you bring that makes it different, or it could be a new theoretical framework. So it could be all of it. So depending on what you're bringing new to the table, that's how you're going to frame your intervention, right? And it doesn't have to be something huge. We're not reinventing the wheel here or doing something. It could be just, I say, like a grain of sand. You're just adding a grain of sand
Mm.
to that pile. I mean, hopefully it's more than that, but usually in some fields, there's so much literature. You're like, what am I saying? Well, you're bringing something new. And that's how we all build. We build off of each other, right? We don't just come out of nowhere. So all those grains of sand are really, really important. So two things. So I said your project overview, your contribution to literature. Okay, got that down. Moving on. Now you need to talk about your methods and your sources. How it's not just a list of what you're using, right? You're not just want to create a laundry list, but how you're applying those sources, right? Your methodology, or how you are analyzing those sources. So for instance, when you have oral interviews, you might want to talk about how you're analyzing those sources, right? How you're approaching those voices. Or you might talk about how you're pairing quantitative, qualitative sources, right? To bring out richer, more robust findings. And then also at that section, you can also talk about any kind of theoretical frameworks that you're using or concepts that you have developed or that you're borrowing for somebody else. It's really cool when you can come up with your own. I think that's a really good, like for your work, right? Yvette, Chicana mother work, like you're bringing in this framework that Doctora Yvette and so on. So, and that's where you talk about that, your methods and your sources. Let's see. Yeah. So just with the methods and the contributions, sometimes they can be the same thing. So just be a little bit, you can always have somebody edit and review your work to make sure you're not repeating yourself. Okay. So those are three things. The last thing I would say then you have to do the main arguments or findings that you have that needs to be all this actually goes in the introduction, these 4 main points, but they're setting up for the whole article. So you need to convey the reader what you have found in your research. You usually do this in the introduction. Some fields are like, no, you just kind of hint at it. Okay, that's fine. Just depends. In history, we kind of, our methodology is narrative. Like we're quote unquote telling a story. Right? But this story is fabricated. We compose it. There's no natural anything to it. It's a narrative that we compose to tell a story that's going to give an argument, right? The argument's kind of hidden, but it's in there. So, you need to set forward the larger argument based on your findings, right? So those are kind of let me back up. Those are two different things. So you're going to tell the reader your findings. I found this. But then you're going to make the larger argument, right? Which is presented through context. So there's two different things, right? So you want to talk about what you found, and then you want to talk about the so what question, right? They're like, this is what I found, but this is why it matters, right? So that's kind of the two different things. So let me give an example. So if I'm doing research and I find, for instance, that the majority of women who lived with abusive husbands chose to stay with them. It's something that I found in my research in the 19th century, right? So that women who live with abusive husbands chose to stay with them. Now, I'm not going to make that argument and just say like, oh, women like to be abused by their husbands, so they stay there. Like, that's not the argument. Rather, I'm going to look to the context and figure out what else is going on that is keeping them in the relationship, right? So it could be other things, So there's a way to make sure those two things go together. So again, that'll usually go, all those elements need to go in the introduction, 4 to 5 pages, maybe 6 really tightly. It's a skill to get in. So that's what you would do introduction. If you're going more than 4 to 5 pages, you're giving away too much. You need to save that for the body of the paper. So, okay, so that was kind of the introduction. Let me talk about the body of the essay. So you want to begin by talking about the background or the context of your topic. So in other words, and this should only be a couple pages. In other words, you need to ask yourself, what does my reader need to know? What does my audience need to know to understand what I'm talking about? Like, you don't just start going into your findings out of left field. Like, you need to give them context, like orient them to what you're talking about. And so you need to, you draft the section. Sometimes you will need to come back to it and add more. Like, oh, I need to add more about this because the reader needs to know that. Or sometimes you can define the concepts as you talk about them in the essay. Maybe it's a smaller
Mhm.
concept. Let me just identify it
Yeah.
as I go along. So not everything belongs in the opening of your essay, or you'll never get to your
I
contribution, right?
know.
I mean, I will say, like, one of my articles literally was 17 pages, the
Yeah.
intro, because I had to cite everybody. What was this person saying? Because I
Yeah.
felt I had no voice. Like, who am I to say anything?
Mhm.
And yet
That
at
was
some
me writing the intro of my dissertation.
I know. And so to get to the point, it was like, what do you want to say? I try to tell my students, like,
Mhm.
don't sabotage yourself. Like, we want to see your voice, right? So once you do the context, you want to present your findings. The way I present my findings, I do it by talking about what I found to be most common. Right? It's kind of very simplistic. But in history, we look for
Mm.
patterns. Like, what are the common
Yeah.
patterns? So what I'm going to be talking about is the first thing the most common pattern. So let me give you another example. For instance, if you want to argue that LGBTQ teens, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer teens, are more likely to run away from home due to physical and mental abuse that they suffer in their household, you're going to need to break that down, right? So you found it's physical and it's
Mhm.
mental abuse in their households. That's why they tend to run away. So you want to present an order of how to present that information. You're like, how am I going to present this information? So usually what I do is I like to develop an order based on some kind of logic. So you need to think about where your logic is and tell the reader, right? For me, it's based on how often I found these kinds of things. So for instance, if I found that mental abuse occurs more often, I'm going to start by talking about the mental abuse, right? Talking
Mhm.
about the mental abuse, the different aspects of it. Then I'll go into physical abuse. You might even divide your paper into two parts, like
Mhm.
subheading, mental abuse, and the next part physical,
Mhm.
or break it up into four parts. These subheadings work really well because these subheadings tell the reader where you're going next.
Yes.
Again, you should think of them as logical steps. Step one, step two. Um, so those are really useful to use those sort of subheadings. My advisor used to tell me not to use them because
Mm.
he used to tell me that he thought it was a crutch. Like you're relying on these things to move you from point A to, which I can kind of see what he's saying. I'm okay with that. I'm
Mhm.
like, okay, yeah, I just need to like signal. Okay, now we're taking a turn here.
Yeah.
Instead of in a narrative, a story, it in history it breaks up the flow, but most
Yeah.
history books have, subheadings. I think it's just to help the reader.
Yes.
So that's one thing, to have those subtopics and in the section are just helpful. Mostly everybody has those to help you move along with your points. What else? Okay, and so let me just say one last thing about the body part. So you're gonna have your different sections. This might be really, really minutia, but it's important.
Mhm.
So when you organize your sections, make sure every paragraph uh, has a topic sentence. Every paragraph
Mhm.
has a purpose in your essay. It's not just like random, let me just add another one because I have to fill the space up. I need to meet my 7,000 word limit. No, every paragraph needs to have a topic sentence. And that topic sentence is a
Yeah.
mini argument, right? So that mini argument, and it has to be the top. Sometimes when your first draft, you don't know what that is because you haven't written through.
Yeah.
So give yourself a break. In your second draft, you'll come back and you'll find it in the middle of a paragraph and you'll pull it out and then pop it back on the top. And so that what happens then, each paragraph is pushing and pushing along your argument, right? And so
Mhm.
that every paragraph has to be like lined up one, two, three, four, in a way that sort of pushes, moves it forward, moves it forward, moves. You can have maybe a second example of the same thing,
Mhm.
but you want to keep pushing forward, keep pushing forward. Just like when you read it, sometimes when you skim reading, right, a book, you read through every first sentence of a paragraph. That's the
Yeah.
argument, right? It's just like point one, point two, point three.
Mhm.
And that takes it sounds simple, but it's hard. It's really hard
That's
to
what I was
do.
gonna
It's
say. I
very
feel
hard.
like it's it's one of those things that I keep saying over and over and over again, especially like when teaching English classes or in any composition classes. A lot of students are not taught the basic skill of how to of paragraph construction. And it continues on, in grad school and in your career of like every paragraph has to have a main point and has to move your overall argument forward. So I'm glad that you stress that because I think we take that for granted when we are writers or when we have this background in literature or in writing. But it's a unacknowledged skill set that I think everybody needs to learn. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wasn't taught writing. I'll just say this. When I was in grad school, I think it was my first or my second year, I had a professor who was very kind, and I was struggling with writing. And he told me, like, you should probably think about taking a class at a junior college to figure out how to write. Essentially, he just said, you
Mm.
don't, I was very fortunate that my advisor, my second advisor, my first one left, he taught me how to write. I mean, he was an editor of a journal and he would
Yeah.
edit my work very, very closely. And essentially I learned backward. I'm not sure if that's the right way to say
Mhm.
it, but I didn't realize writing was so structured. There's that inspiration thing. I don't
Yeah.
know. It's so structured. It's so mechanical that I did it maybe the wrong way, but I finally, after 3 books, to figure out. So yeah, it's like when you look at a book, there's so much work that's gone into it, or an article. It's
Yeah.
not just come together out of inspiration. No way.
Mhm.
It's
But
highly
see, that's what
technical.
people read.
Yeah.
Like students, undergraduates read that and they think, I'm never going to be a good writer. I could never write like that because they don't see this whole process. Like you're sharing us what goes on behind, like breaking it down, the article writing process. It goes to show like you have to be very intentional in the writing process and it takes multiple drafts
Yeah.
and folks
Yeah.
don't see that behind the scenes and that's why they think I can never achieve that. So I'm sure
Yeah.
the younger you probably thought I'm never going to be a great writer or I could never write like that because you had not received that formal like training and instruction on it. Yeah.
Right. Right. And now this is not at all to tell people not to try to write or try to think they have to get from point A to point Z. Who
Yeah.
does that? Nobody, right?
Hmm.
It's you write drafts and and you have people, hopefully you have a kind person who will read it and say like, this is, here's what you're trying to say. It's right here. And I really believe in that mantra of writing is thinking.
Hmm.
So writing is thinking. So like, I don't know what I'm going to argue before I've said it because I haven't said it. It's just me. Some people just seem to have their arguments already before they've even processed the material. But I'm more like, I have the right to think things through. And when I get to the end, I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, then I have
Me
those
too.
aha moment. Or later we're in the shower or exercising or
Hmm.
something. It's like, oh, that's the so what? Like, oh, that's why this doesn't
Yeah.
matter. And then we go back to revise. So it's always moving, it's always evolving, living document. And for me, I worked really hard from my first book to my second book, and I would read, subscribe to Writer's Digest. I read books on
Mm.
writing to try to help me. I mean,
Wow.
not everything, but what makes for better, writers. I read
Mhm.
books, literature that I loved reading that like the author who wrote The Kite Runner, the third book he did. The third book is my favorite. Incredible writing and just also Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other
Mhm.
Suns. That is just beautiful writing, history, and it won a Pulitzer. One of her books won a Pulitzer. So that kind of writing. So read what you love
Mhm.
and then try to, I don't want to say model it, but like think about the little words they throw in here and there. But I think
Mhm.
it's really important to think about voice, and I'll say something about that. So lastly, for your article, you're going to need a conclusion, which I do not like conclusions
Yeah.
because I feel like they're really, really hard for me because I felt like I've already said what I had to say. I'm done. Please don't make me go through this again. Right? You're like, I'm exhausted. But you might look at what just begin by restating what you said, just as an easy crutch. What did you say? Look at your topic sentences, kind of. And then that's the point where you get a chance to do the so what again. Now, why does this all matter? Hopefully you can come away with something at the end that says, something greater, right?
Mhm.
The sum of the whole is greater than the individual parts kind of thing. If you're still having trouble, just set it aside, have somebody read it. If you have the opportunity to present at a conference, sometimes somebody will say it in the audience and you're just like, that's
Mhm.
it. Like somebody will just,
Mhm.
because they see it. We tend to bury, sometimes what happens, this is a metaphor, we like take a shovel and we bury this hole and we get in there so deep. We're so deep, we cannot see out
Yeah.
anymore. Sometimes you need somebody just walking by and looking down at what you're doing and go, oh, you're doing this. And you're like, yes, thank you. But because
Mhm.
sometimes we just lose sight of what we're doing and we're having a hard time coming up for fresh air. So I
Right.
find that when I've had my articles and somebody's reviewed them, giving me feedback, that's been the spark for the book project. Like they see something in it that I didn't.
Mm.
And I'm like, oh, I didn't think about that. That's a good point. So it's good to get yourself out there to share your article with maybe people who you trust and maybe even like people you don't know, because then they'll give you that feedback and that sparks. So it's so generative, as they say.
Mhm.
So generative. Instead of keeping it, it goes nowhere and you're going to get really depressed and bummed and whatever about that. So yeah, I would say those things are important. Now I was thinking I might talk a little bit about the review process for articles.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think sometimes people don't know about that.
It's good because I was gonna follow up with asking a little bit more about like timelines and strategy because that's one of the things that kind of can get in the way of students successfully publishing while they're still in graduate school is that one,
Yeah.
they might not know how long it takes. They might not know the reviewing process or even what is and isn't allowed about submitting your work to one or more journals.
Mhm.
And then the second part is the strategizing piece of it of like, well, how can you set yourself up for success? By knowing how long it takes and
Yeah.
what the reviewers do on the back end.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. I think that all these are really good, and there's no one right answer for everybody. I always tell my students to focus on the dissertation, just get the dissertation out. But the
Hmm.
reality is that they need to juggle, publishing articles because that's what's
Yeah.
going to get them recognized and get them interviews, no matter where, in terms of context where you're thinking about ending up. But I think what you need to do before you choose where to send your article is think about to do some research into the journal, right? Usually, I like to have one or two journals in mind. That way, I can write to that
Hmm.
audience. Like when your intervention in the literature, you're going to have to talk about that literature for whatever field that is. So if it's like a women's studies versus perhaps history of science, perhaps cultural studies, so you're going to have to write differently for those different audiences. So do that before you plan to submit, because the journal might go like, this is for us, this is for another field. So that's really important before to think about audience. Um, you need to also pay attention to the review process, which is really important. So what usually happens is when you send your article, you send it to the editor, who reads it based on your abstract and decides whether or not to send it out to review. Right. So the editor usually, sometimes they do, but the editor usually doesn't make the final call. Well, yes and no. They make a call, but it's based on
Hmm.
other people's input. They don't do it alone. So whether they get their essay and they're like, oh, this looks really good. Like, yeah, I think we would be interested. They send it out. Or sometimes they have a board, an editorial board. So the editor will go like, oh, I think these two people on the editorial board should look at it to see if we should send it out to for review. So I'm on several editorial boards, and sometimes I'll be like, hey, look at this abstract. What do you think? She would give it the
Hmm.
thumbs up, thumbs down, or tell them to go somewhere else. And I'll say, oh, it looks interesting. Or I'll say, like, oh, maybe not. So so at that point, right. So once they say, yes, we're interested in this article, then they send it out for what's called blind review. And there could be double blind. So usually a blind review means that the editor will know who you are, the reviewer will know who you are, but you won't know who the reviewer is. Right? So as the
Hmm.
author, you have no idea who's reviewing it. And that's a good
Yeah.
thing, usually.
Hmm.
And sometimes it could be double blind. It could be that the reviewer doesn't know who you are. So they have no idea. So that I've been in both situations. And I think the double blind is probably best for everybody. Let me see. Okay. Okay. And then once you get, so then, then it can, once it goes out to reviewers, usually you get two reviewers at least. They like to have two different people review your article. You might ask, it's no problem asking the editor, how long does it take? What is your general time frame? The
Hmm.
editors will ask the reviewers, please return it to us within 6 months, 1 month, 2 months. And they might
Hmm.
say, yeah, I will, but they don't.
Hmm.
That happens. So it's out of everyone's control except for that person. Nevertheless, it gets sent out, say it comes back in 2 months under time frame, and then you get the comments back, right? So um, once you get those comments back, the editor will look at them, right? The editor collects it
Hmm.
too, will look at them and say like, we'll either do one or two things. Usually they'll read them and then write a little review in response and say like, okay, this looks
Hmm.
really good, both of them are positive. We're going to go for it. Please, they'll write to you, say, look at the comments and see and respond to them in a
Yeah.
memo. How are you going to respond to those? That's the best case scenario, right? One review is positive, one is negative, and the editor might go, okay, I see this point, but I see that point. And then they write a balanced letter. So the editor is going to be like the intermediary for these external reviews. And so then, nevertheless, you will get a word from the editor. You'll get the reviews, and then you'll get the editor statement, and then you will be allowed, if they want you to revise and resubmit, to respond in writing how you're going to do those changes.
Hmm.
It's a lot. I mean, this is like,
Yeah.
but it's helping you think through all these points, right? Sometimes the reviewers have no idea like what you're talking about, or they didn't put the time into it. I mean, that happens.
Hmm.
Sometimes they're excellent. They really love your piece. They're just asking you to
Mhm.
think of things that you hadn't thought about before. So that's really great. So at that point, you're usually told three categories. There's probably more, but one is like publish as is with minor edits. That's like usually that never happens. That's rare, but maybe. So that'd be
Yeah.
good. Revise and resubmit is most common. Like we like this, but
Mhm.
we want you to expand on that. Do this, do that. That means they're really happy with it. They just want to see
Yeah.
it grow more. And then you'll get sometimes like a rejection saying, maybe. So at that point, you have to then think about, in all those cases, think about what you want to do and what has been said and how are you going to proceed next. Um, so, so yeah, I think that the rejection one sometimes feel, what do I say? And that's really hard. You need to, think about, hopefully you got comments and think about how you want to, shift that. Don't just turn, I would say, do not just turn right around and submit it somewhere else. Some people do that.
Mhm.
Journal editors, it's a very tight knit world. People know each
Mhm.
other. So I don't know. I would just say be careful with that. And at all times, you can inquire about timeline, because that's really important
Yeah.
for the process because it can take 6 months to a year, sometimes 2 years, hopefully not. But some journals are so behind production. They're like, oh, we have a 2-year framework, timeline, excuse me. So, and if you're a grad student, say you're in your third year, fourth year, and you want to get this out and you're trying to write your chapters, it's really hard to sort of balance those two things, right? And thinking about, could you make a dissertation? It's possible. There's different scenarios. So, for instance, you can take a dissertation chapter, a part of that, and then make it into a smaller article that you can maybe
Mhm.
get published into an anthology with a collection of essays. Or you could, like I said, chapter looks different than an article, so you're going to have to,
Yeah.
so you're going to have to maybe spend time away from your dissertation, which my students sometimes do. And I'm like, well, they've already made a commitment, so it's okay.
Yeah.
So it's a balance. It just depends on what you need to be really smart in how you decide to publish that article. Like make it part of your dissertation, but don't overpublish your dissertation. There's like a rule
Mhm.
of thumb, like 30%. Don't publish
Mhm.
more than 30% of your dissertation because when you want to publish the books, they're going to be like, we've seen this. How is this
Yeah, I've
new?
heard that.
So you got
Mhm.
to be careful with that too. So always seek the advice of mentors, not your advisor necessarily, but mentors, like, um, you know, and what kinds of publications, academic journals, online journals, there's pedagogy pieces, perhaps there's public facing work,
Mhm.
websites, blogs, things like that. So you can also do those as well. Those also look good on resumes, I think. But of course, the journal articles, the peer review journal articles, are going to be really more competitive in terms of the academic market if that's what you're looking
Mhm.
for. So,
So I want to kind of shift gears.
sure.
Well, not shift gears, but I want to ask you about mistakes because you've been telling us like what to expect and what goes on from the reviewer side and a little bit more about inquiring about timelines, things like that, making sure you get it done on time before you graduate if that's something you're interested in for your career. But what about yeah, what would you say are just instead of the opposite of best practices,
Yeah,
so worst practices or
I'm good
common
at the mistakes,
mistakes? Yeah.
especially in grad school. Some
They don't
professors
all have to be our mistakes.
I know. That's true. I remember, my dear friend or dear mentor, Vicky Ruiz, sometimes she reminds you of things I would say in grad school. I'm like, ouch, don't remind me I said that. I thought it was, you think we know everything, right? Um,
Uh,
so yeah, common mistakes. I have quite a few here. Okay. So first, don't just go to the biggest or most prestigious journal in your field. And, I mean, it's not that you can't, not that it's
yeah.
impossible, but you're going to be, start maybe middle or lower hanging fruit, as they say. So I would say that look at a range of journals. Um, yeah. So also don't think about going to the most popular or the most hippest journal, even then
Yeah.
that's the thing, right? To publish again. Um, you need to know the process, right? Not knowing the process is a mistake or bothering to learn the process, right? So that's really important. So you need to take time to even figure out how that process works. There's tons
Mhm.
of articles online about that, I've seen a lot. So there's a lot that you can figure out about what to do. Another mistake is not taking feedback well. That's really important. Again,
That's a
ignoring what people are telling you. I mean, I call it a mistake. You might say, well, I know they don't know what they're talking about. It's really hard because sometimes it could be like very microaggressive. Like it could be a microaggression. It could be like they're just being straight out
Mhm.
racist or sexist or whatever.
Yeah.
So, or ableist, you need to separate what they're saying. So have somebody else read it. I think that that's good.
Mhm.
It might be helpful for them to help you put perspective on it, especially if you're feeling really
Yeah.
personally hurt because it's ourselves we're putting out there. I mean, I don't care if they're saying it's just
Mhm.
professional. It's you. I mean, how much time did you spend on that
Yeah.
thing? And you're really going out on a limb. And to have people come trash it, maybe they're not trashing, maybe they're trying to be. Some people are not very good at giving feedback. They're just like, this sucks. I could tell you some things people have said to my work. And so,
Oh,
and
me
we're,
too.
you still remember those.
We
I
remember the
know. Why
most
use that?
horrific comments,
Why
right?
don't we remember the beautiful stuff people say? Um, but I think it's important to learn how to, especially like if your article's under review, you get back the comments, and you're not going to say in your reply like you're all wrong. Of course not. You're going to
Yeah.
say like, oh, that's a really good point. What I'm saying is blah blah blah. So just know how to turn it around and be gracious.
Mhm.
If you're not willing to learn, then why are you in the business? Kind of thing. I don't know. We're all learning. I still learn. I'm so
Yeah.
much more to learn. So I'm always grateful when people have, after you finish graduate school, you'll be grateful that anybody takes the time to read your stuff and give you feedback. Right now, your advisor is paid to do what they do. So remember that.
Mhm.
That's what they do. Um, so also another mistake is not taking advice from senior scholars. Not all senior scholars, but of course, those who have a good track record of being empowering mentors, trusted mentors by others. So
Mhm.
just listen to them. You might not agree, but it's good to listen. And also, I would say not workshopping the essays or sending it to somebody else for feedback. Don't just, you have to let somebody else look at it before you send it to them just to get feedback. So that's, I think, another mistake.
Yeah. And I also want to mention one of a topic related to when you mentioned earlier my episode about like
Hmm.
the dissertation, how to like manage dissertation writing anxiety.
Yeah.
One of the key things that comes up is related to motivation and also related to like making time for it when you have so many other competing factors in your life and in your potentially, like if we're talking about the graduate student scenario in your graduate school journey, there's so many things. You might be taking courses, you might have exams, you might be working on a dissertation, trying to gather your data, conducting interviews, you name it. There's so many things that could be coming up professionally and personally. So I know, having worked on a dissertation and having co-authored a book with you, that it can be quite daunting to make time and to maintain motivation for a long form writing project like writing an article. So how do you maintain motivation, focus? How do you prioritize that among all of your other competing, parts of your life? Or even how do you stay grounded in the writing and revision process? Because you just mentioned, based on all the potential, I guess, common mistakes, that there's a lot that comes up that can be challenging. So, yeah, any insights, any consejos that you have about
Yeah.
staying motivated or grounded?
Yeah. It's a hard question because I feel like I'm such a different point where your audience members are. So if I go back, let me just a couple of things from the different. So when I was in grad
I mean, you
school,
are, but also just
hmm,
I don't I because you're saying I'm at such a different stage. You are, but you're a full professor, so accomplished in your career, and yet you still make time to conduct research, to read, to write. Like you're still doing the work. You're not just like, yeah, I'm done.
yeah, it's kind of because nobody
That's
tells you when you're done. So just keep going. Um, I think that many things. So yes, the writing process takes a long time. We see so little return for the sacrifices we make. And I think that's what turns people off, right? Because it happens so slowly. So it's like my colleague of mine equated it to like it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, right?
Mhm.
Another colleague said to me, like, think of it as chipping away at a mountain. You can't scale the mountain in one day, so you got to chip away little by
Mhm.
little. So definitely, it's just one of these. It's like this is not a short term, like blast off. You're going to be done. But definitely in the end, you see the hard work there. You need to celebrate yourself. I'm trying to do that a little bit more, like, give yourself. But I think that, so yeah, for me, for writing, I remember in grad school, I would kind of postpone. I mean, it's hard to balance it when you were like full time? When do you get the writing done? I think for me, it's different now because I value any little bit of time I get. When I have it, I write, and I like shut everything out. I had my two kids, and then I
Hmm.
published some books through there, and it was just, the, you know, I was more productive when after I had my kids because I knew the clock was running or the meter,
Yeah.
so expensive. So I was just like, heck yeah, I'm going to be done by 5 o'clock. Just like, "Arr," just race, just typing as quickly. But I think there are some key things that people have always mentioned. Like one is to find a space that works for you. It can change. It can change, and it usually does because usually we find ourselves after a while how that space doesn't work for us. So we find ways to sabotage ourselves.
Hmm.
Develop a routine, whatever that is. Maybe you're a morning, maybe you're afternoon, maybe you're an evening person, but develop a routine when it's quiet. That's always the best thing. Find out what works for you and what doesn't, right? Know thyself. That's super,
Mm.
super important. Some people really, really like having a group to write with. It's the write on site things, where you don't feel completely alone. At least somebody's sitting next to you, or you do that.
Yes.
Right? You've talked about this, how you can do Zoom,
Yeah.
or setting a timer. All those techniques, if that works for you. Those don't work for me. I've never used them for the most part. I value being alone, and I'm really comfortable with it. And I'm just like, leave me alone. Like I'm so used to, which is kind of, I think, a grad school thing. It's what I tell people when they want to go to grad school. I'm like, are you okay being alone? Because
Hmm.
not lonely, well, maybe sometimes lonely, but alone because you have to do your work
Yeah.
alone. And so if you're not comfortable, then it might not be for you. And then also, I think rewarding yourself is really important. Uh, that after you've done some things, give yourself some kind of rewards that to show to sort of recognize these moments because when you write, when you get into the writing mode, you're like in a fog. Like
Hmm.
you write and then you're like, because everybody else is like normal, and
Yeah.
you're in this because you're in another world, right? You've had to transport
Yeah.
yourself to whatever world you're writing in and immerse yourself in that literature to have your voice come through, right? And that was one thing is about finding that voice, finding that sweet spot between what you have to say and how you want to say it. Right?
Mm.
In my experience, it takes time. So my first books are really dry, and I was like, I'm not writing a dry book again. So that's why I
Mm.
said I read literature that I enjoyed reading, and even history books. Like, how do you want to write? You can change your voice. I like to do
Yeah.
more like we did in our book, which is the way
Mhm.
I want to write is like more
Mm.
conversational. I'm okay with that. I want
Yeah.
people to read it. I don't want to be stuck on a shelf, just you know, collecting dust as they do. So, it was funny, I was reading a book recently, one of my grad student, recommended it. I had it on my shelf, and I was like and it got all this praise, and I was reading it. I'm like, "Oh, I really like this book." And then somebody said, like, "The reading is like a biography or something like that." And I was like, "Yeah, that's why I like it because the reading is so
Mm.
digestible. It just moves and moves."
Yes.
And that's what I like. So I think that doing all these things, this our profession is writing forward, writing intensive. So,
Mhm.
I don't know. If it's really hard to get a group, I think being accountable, have an accountability group. I did have one in grad school, so that was setting small goals for yourself. Don't beat yourself up. One paragraph at a time. My advisor used to say one
Yeah.
page at a time, at a day. Poco poquito. Every time you come back to, you're like, oh, I had a
Mhm.
paragraph. You're like, oh, I'm on page 4. And then not one day you're just going along, and then you stop. Okay, come back to it.
Yeah.
Consistency is really important. If you leave a week or two, you're gonna have to restart almost. I did.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying, like being consistent and, that's really important. So
Those are all great insights. I feel like that's already like I was going to ask you any other consejos, words of advice, but really if you have any we're getting close to wrapping up, so I would love to hear if you have any closing words or just any words of wisdom for first-gen BIPOC students listening to this who are new to writing and new to publishing and who are curious and interested in publishing an article as they start out in their publication trajectory. What do you want to say to them?
I think that's really important, is to, I don't know, I kind of think like sometimes when we look at those articles that seem idealized, like we want to reach there, it's like, don't start there. Don't, start with what you have. And um, I think that for me, right now, what I'm trying to do is to move beyond sort of the academic writing, and I want to get in more into a more broader audience that more people will read my
Ooh.
work. So that's important. I think that maybe depending, like I have a hard time writing without anything, like, because I'm a historian, I need my evidence, so-called, my records, my
Mm-hmm.
documents. That's my crutch. What I base everything on that. Some people who are creative writers, I don't know how they do that. Um, so I think that, you know, everyone does it differently. I think read and listen to what other people have to do, but sometimes just maybe even free writing might help people. But for me, outlining is good. Just very bare bones. I'm not a detailed, but write. And I think that things will start happening. Easier
Mm-hmm.
said than done. I know it's so hard, but I'm happy to, that's not probably wasn't very useful, but I am happy to talk to anybody who's interested. I can follow up with you have my information and so forth, but
Yeah.
because it's really hard to give people advice based on the fact that people are such different spaces and because
Yeah.
there's different kinds of pressure with social media and people are like, and then always, that's why I'm not on social media because
Mm-hmm.
I can't handle the FOMO, like that maybe I'm being really slow or I'm being really, what is so-and-so doing? Fulanito, fulanita, what are they doing?
Mm-hmm.
And why am I not doing that? And that just makes it worse. Then you just
Yes.
spiral and that's not what you want.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, that wasn't very useful, but just keep plugging away, just
Yeah.
consistency, keep coming back at it. And do things. Oh, one last thing I should say. You do things outside of your writing space that you should have something to show for, because in writing it takes so long to get any kind of results.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I was like, I was running, doing marathons or doing whatever, something where you're like, I did something. Like I have something tangible, right? Knit something. I don't care. Sew something, paint something, get out,
Create.
create
Yeah.
something else, because the writing process takes too long to see anything. It's not going to motivate you if you don't. So do
Yeah.
something outside of it. Have another identity. Have multiple identities,
Mm-hmm.
and then that'll hopefully inspire you to keep doing what you're doing.
I love that. And I find that when you're in that creative space, when you're like literally creating something, that's when you generate the most ideas. That's when you allow yourself to percolate and like think about kind of what's coming up for you in your writing. So I actually think it can be quite a productive um, process to lean into creativity and hobbies. Not all forms of, just FYI, like not all forms of procrastination are bad. And a little bit of procrastination, whether that's the hobby or, the time that you take to get started, could potentially lead to you coming up with better ideas. So
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
glad that you mentioned that, because I do think it's super duper important to have a life outside of grad school, outside of
Oh
academia,
yeah,
outside of your 9 to 5. Yeah.
yeah. The whole, like, don't put all your eggs in one basket is definitely
Yeah.
true. Because what happens when that doesn't work out for you?
Mm-hmm.
You don't want that. You don't want your whole life coming down because somebody said your article sucked or whatever.
Yeah.
There's other parts of you they don't know you. That's just one part of you. So I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's an important thing to think about. So
Well,
yeah,
I want to thank you so much, Doctora Miroslava Miros, for sharing your knowledge, your
sure.
experience, your wisdom, your insights, your consejos, all of the
I
things with
hope it
us
was
today.
helpful and not confusing because I tend to talk quickly. So I'm
No,
happy
very
to chat.
helpful.
Okay,
Very. Yeah.
great. Yeah, and I also have an article that's on scholarly publishing. It's sort of like my advice to junior scholars who want to publish. So it's available. But yeah, just hit me up through email.
You
That's my
know,
number one.
I was
I
going
also
to
have
say, yeah,
my
I
website at the
forgot
history
to,
department. My email or
I
at the
completely
history
forgot.
department. I'm at UCSB history department. You can find me there. Um, not very much on social media. So those are the two main ways.
So we'll add those links to the show notes. So if you can give me the links to the article, to
Oh yeah.
your
Okay.
history website, and then is it okay if we link them to your LinkedIn account? Would that be okay? I know you do
Sure.
have.
Yeah, I do. I haven't really keep it up. I'll give you all the links, and actually, I
Uh,
have other articles that I didn't write. I do quite a few on writing because
yeah.
yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah.
Cool.
I'm happy to put up
Okay.
whatever links you're comfortable sharing and whatever
Sure.
method of communicating or contact information you want us to share with the audience.
Sounds great. Thank you so
Okay.
much. Really appreciate it. It's
Thank
been fun.
you. Thanks so much for joining me in the Grad School Femtoring podcast. If you like what you heard, here are 4 ways you can support the show. The first is to make sure you're subscribed and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. The second way is to get your copy of my free Grad School Femtoring resource kit, which includes essential information to prepare for and navigate grad school. You can access it at the link in today's show notes. The third way to support my show is to follow me on social media. You can find me on Instagram with the handle @GradSchoolFemtoring and on LinkedIn by searching my name. The last way to show your love is to sign up to work with me via my Grad School Femtoring Academy, my group coaching program for First-Gen BIPOCs seeking to work on their personal growth and gain sustainable productivity skills. You can learn more at gradschoolfemtoring.com/academy. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.